How's it going, guys? We just had our fourth class in our beginner series, and we learned so much in this last class. And most of what we went over first was about composition. But before we dive into the composition, we always want to check in on our mindset when we start off our week, and kind of, remembering that we are all beginners. So y'all know that I love Julia Cameron, and I'm working through Finding Water, the Art of Perseverance, and this is in part of her Artist's Way series. And now you have to understand, Julia at this point in her life is, she's written musicals for Broadway, she's written operas, she's written all these novels and stuff, but she is learning how to play the piano, which even though she's writing music, she doesn't play. So we read this in class. We're never too old to be young at heart. Being young at heart means simply being willing to be a beginner. I have a special satchel that I carry my music papers in. I keep that satchel in a particular corner near the piano. Nothing else is allowed to take its place there. I'm like a kindergartner with her first school bag. It took courage to allow myself to pursue something that I loved. I had to allow myself the luxury of learning. I had to focus on process and not the finished product. I could not think about the distance I had to travel before I could call myself a pianist. I had to remember that I was learning to play the piano, and the word play was operative here. To begin all, I had to resign from competition. I had to stop comparing myself to my idols. My brother Christopher is a virtuoso keyboard player. I'm friends with a magnificent classical pianist named Robert McDonald. When those men touch a piano, it unlocks its mysteries for them. When I touch a key, it's terra incognita. So the point of this is we're all beginners in something, and the process and the learning is what's the most important part. So if you find yourself comparing yourself to your neighbor or someone else, we have to be beginners. So let's go over kind of some of the composition stuff we went over in class. And we're keeping this really, really simple because, this is a beginner class, right? So composition is basically how you want the viewer's eye to go through. And we talked a lot about the rule of thirds. It's based on the golden ratio. I'm not a mathematician, so we're not going into that. But you wanna first start when you're planning your composition with what your focal point is. And here, placed directly in the center, the focal point is here, right? So what happens if we use the rule of thirds instead? And that places, and it's just a much more interesting composition. So the rule of thirds, when we're looking at our paintings and how to plan, we are going to draw basically a tic-tac-toe, and the points of those intersections are where we want to keep our interest. So this is the star of our show, the focal point, and it's here, and it's a much more dynamic composition than this. Even though in this one we have a whole lot more foreground information and stuff, in this one, it just, your eye travels to where you want it to go. Now, there are so many famous examples of the rule of thirds, just to go over a few, let's see. This is Albert Breda, Sargent. I mean, it's really dynamic. This one is Delacroix, and it's hard to see here, but Jesus is really right here. Even with Cézanne's self-portrait here, you can see that this is drawing the attention, but his eyes are directly going to here. So even though he looks centered, he's actually moving the eye around the self-portrait by where he's placed himself here. Let's see. This is Van Gogh. It's a still life by Van Gogh. And you can see, got the shiny part of the apple here. We've got the flowers in this area. And this is your real focal point here. Here's an example of a photograph that uses the rule of thirds, right? Here's just Jerry's Artorama. It's a kid's project, but we have the main star, the butterfly here, right up in this corner. And then you've got another star butterfly right over here, and another butterfly right over here. So really just moving the eye around. In this one by Charles Reed, it's interesting because she's kind of doing what the Cezanne painting was doing and focusing onto this spot, but the sharp way that her arm is and the bend, that's moving the eye all the way around. So I think that one's really interesting. And then Leonardo da Vinci is doing the same here. The mouth is at one apex, the eye is basically at another. And then we have the crown of thorns, a very dark part here, and then a darker part here. So it is, again, moving the eye all the way around the painting. So there is a handout, and I'll put a link to that if you didn't get it. Put this in your notebook. It's talking about the rule of thirds. And then, so not only do you need to find your focal point, you want to make sure it's not in the dead center, and then you have at least 2 layers of depth. So all the way in the back, your middle ground, your foreground. And how are you guiding your viewer's eye? And then basically when you're planning out a sketch for your painting, go ahead and draw the tic-tac-toe and sketch on top of it, right? And then the final is, this is probably the most useful, right? When you're planning your painting, to have a thing like this where you can have your checklist. Okay, how is this working? And you won't need this for more than 1 or 2 paintings. You'll start doing it automatically. But composition basics, that's one big thing that we went over in class today.